Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we're looking at the controversial AMD FX4100. This will be an all AMD build, pairing this motherboard with the AMD Radeon HD7770. We're going to be doing the usual stuff, synthetic benchmarks and play some games. So stick around and see what these puppies can do. Welcome back. This is the AMD FX4100, released back in October 2011. Based off the Bulldozer Core Zen Bezi, it's on the 32nm node, has a base clock of 3.6 GHz, a full load turbo boost at 3.7 GHz, and half load turbo boost at 3.8 GHz. All multipliers on the CPU are unlocked. It has 2x2 meg of L2 cache and 8 meg of level 3 cache. The AMD FX4100 is a 4-threaded CPU and comprises of 2 Bulldozer cores. The Bulldozer core basically has a shared floating point unit and 2 integer units, which basically in Windows or operating systems looks like 2 threads. Now, AMD got in trouble with the AMD FX8000-9000 series CPUs. Now, to AMD, the 8000-9000 series CPUs are 8 cores. But the rest of the world felt different, because sharing an FPU is not really a whole core between 2. It's kind of similar to Intel's hyper-threading, but also it's not. This is the Radeon HD7770 by AMD. This GPU is based off the Cape Verde XT architecture, released in February 2012. Our version that we're looking at today is from Sapphire. This card has 1GB of GDDR5 running at 1250 MHz, and its core clock is at 1150 MHz. API support for this card is Direct3D 11 and OpenCL 2.0, OpenGL 4.5, and it does support Vulkan 1.0. The motherboard we got today is from Gigabyte. This is the GA-970A-D3. This is a socket AM3 Plus motherboard with 4 DDR3 DIMMs. We've loaded up these RAM slots with 4 lots of 2GB of DDR3 RAM, clocked at 1333 MHz. We are using 2 different brands, PQI and King Max. Hard drives we're running today is a 120GB Western Digital Green SSD and a 240GB Western Digital Green. We have also 1TB Western Digital Green hard drive or magnetic. Operating system running today is Windows 10 build 2004. Let's kick off the benchmarks. The first synthetic benchmark we're using today is 7-zip. In 7-zip, our single core score for the FX4100 was 3,304 points, with a multi-core score of 10,345. The FX4100 beat the i3-2120 in the multi-score core, but in single core looked like it fell behind. However, it wasn't by much. Overall, the AMD FX4100 in the 7-zip benchmarks did pretty good and sat about in the middle of the pack. In CPU ID, CPU Z, the FX4100 showed a different story. We had benched the lowest score for single-core and multi-core scores. Now, the single-core score was 199.8 points and multi-core score was 657.3. Whatever CPU Z is doing to benchmark, the AMD FX series is not a fan of it. In Citybench R15, we got 270 points for the AMD FX4100. Scoring the lowest score in the bench, we weren't too far away from the i3-2120. In the real world is probably its direct competitor. I know we benched last in this bench and a couple other benches, but I think there's still a bit of promise that this thing can game. Moving on to the GPU, the HD7770 in Citybench R15 scored 58.87 frames per second, giving us a nice strong score and placing us in 3rd position. Unity in Heaven, we scored 344 points for the HD7770, placing us in 3rd once again. There is a bigger gap between the GTX 750 and much bigger between the GTX 770, which should be about right because those cards are a lot better. In 3D Mark's 5 Strike benchmark test, the AMD FX4100 with the HD7770 scored 379 points, placing us once in 3rd place again and just a little bit behind the GTX 750 and a long way off the GTX 770. We pushed out in front of the HD5850 by about 1,000 points. All the data's looking quite promising for playing games. However, the proof's in the pudding, so let's play some games. The first game we're playing today is Rare's Sea of Thieves. Game settings we had for Sea of Thieves was 1920 by 1080p resolution with cursed settings, or better known as very low. Now for the most of the game, it ran pretty smooth. Gave you a pretty playable experience until it had to load an island in. At this point, you could be waiting a second until you saw the next frame. So this could be very painful and very bad. Now, we would say this is due to the AMD FX4100 just not being able to punch out that data quick enough. So the benchmarks we got for Sea of Thieves, average frame rate was 39.1 frames per second. Minimum frame rate fell at 0.4 frames per second. Maximum frame rate was 54.9 frames per second. 1% lows was 5.6 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows was 0.4 frames per second. As you can see, the 0.1% lows showed some severe stutter, and that was those loading of the islands. It would also struggle loading some of the just gaming assets like the guns and some of the models. Other than suffering that stutter, 40 frames per second is actually not too bad to play this game. Jumping into our RPG genre, we have Path of Exile. Now the game did look like it ran pretty good, but it did have a couple of issues, like a bunch of bats coming around to chase and beat me up. Eventually the monster models loaded in, so I could see it wasn't just a bunch of bats. However, it did this for just a bit, and then after a while, it just stopped doing it. So other than that, the game ran pretty good. We ran Path of Exile at 1920 by 1080, and our graphics preset was set to low. Now, the benchmarks for this game, our average frame rate was 54.8 frames per second, minimum frame rate was 23.3 frames per second, our maximum frame rate was 60.7 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows were 2.4 frames per second. So the game suffered from a little bit of stutter, but nothing too bad, not for this genre. So you definitely could have a playable experience with this game. I am a little concerned that maybe some of the bigger areas that it may run into some loading issues. Moving to Riot's game's title, Valorant. In this game at 1920 by 1080 at low settings. This game ran really well on this machine. Now, we did suffer a little bit of stutter, but a lot of that stutter was at the beginning of the round. So once everything is loaded in, you're pretty much good to go. Benchmarks for Valorant, average frame rate was 75.7 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 20.9 frames per second, and the maximum frame rate was 109 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows fell to 1.8 frames per second. So all in all, that's a pretty good result. Now, the minimum frame rate did get down to 20, but I think that was more at the beginning of the game. It didn't seem to do that while I was playing. I didn't notice it, but our verdict for this game runs fantastic on our AMD system. Moving into a newer title, Phasmophobia. Now, if you don't know what this game is a cooperative ghost hunting game, basically. We ran Phasmophobia at 1920 by 1080 with low settings. This game ran pretty good for the most of it. There was some dips, and because it is a different type of game, it's kind of like a first-person shooter, but it's not. So I don't think those dips are going to hurt you. Benchmarks for Phasmophobia, our average frame rate was 44.8 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate fell to 1.9 frames per second. Maximum frame rate was 80.7 frames per second. 0.1% lows was 1.5 frames per second. So not silky smooth, but for this genre, I think you'd be okay playing this game and it won't annoy you too much. Though there is stutters and dips, I don't think it's going to be too detrimental to your gameplay. Next game we played was Blizzard's Overwatch, and this game did not run great on this CPU. CPU generally spent most of its time hitting 90 to 100%. Now, there was a lot of stutter, and this game was pretty much unplayable. Now, we ran Overwatch at lower settings in 720p. Now, we did run it in 1920 by 1080 as well, and we ended up getting pretty similar results. Now, the stutters generally happen when there's a lot of battle going on. So a lot of stuff happening, a lot of models loading. As you can see right now, it's starting to stutter. And it gets worse and worse as more and more happens. Benchmarks for Overwatch was average frame rate of 16.5 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was at 2.7 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate was 32.9. Our 0.1% lows was 1.7 frames per second. Now, we don't know what the story is, but we would have thought the AMD FX4100 would have done a lot better in this title. Moving on to Fortnite. We ran Fortnite at low settings with 1920 by 1080 as the resolution preset. Most of this game, it ran pretty good. Now, it did suffer from some stutter and dips, but the rest of it left you a good space for gameplay. Benchmarks for Fortnite, our average frame rate was 64.5 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 23.3 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate was 95 frames per second. 0.1% lows fell to 4.4 frames per second. So the frame rate data did show a couple of dips and a couple of stutters, and that's exactly what we found. Other than that, the game ran perfectly fine. It didn't have any problems loading in areas, which we found in some lower CPUs and lower RAM systems. So the FX4100 and the HD7770 for Fortnite is good to go. The AMD FX4100 and the HD7770 Rocket League ran perfectly smooth. Running our resolution at 1920 by 1080 and our presets were on medium. This game gave us on this system a smooth, silky experience. You wouldn't even question the hardware in this game. Benchmarks for Rocket League, average frame rate was 96.3 frames per second, minimum frame rate was 72.3 frames per second, and maximum frame rate was 117.1 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows was 23.6 frames per second. We can definitely up the graphics in this game. With those performance figures, we're looking pretty good. So Rocket League on the AMD FX4100 with the HD7770 is a big plus, a big win on this system. Our last game today is Genshin Impact. Resolution we ran for Genshin Impact was 1920 by 1080. We had the game settings, graphic-wise, set to high. The game did suffer from a stutter from time to time, but for the most of it, the game played with pretty good frame rates, giving you quite a good playable experience. Now, the frame rate for Genshin Impact, average frame rate was 57.1 frames per second, minimum frame rate was 2.8 frames per second, maximum frame rate was 61.3 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows was 1.1 frames per second. As you can see, there was a couple of dips and there was a couple of stutters. So a lot of this was loading some detail up and assets. So the AMD system we built here seemed to run this game pretty good. Now, we could pull some of the details back and see if that would pull up the minimum frame rates, but I think a lot of that had to do with just the stutter on loading of the world. Now, wrapping up what we've seen today with the AMD FX4100 married with the HD7770 by AMD. Now, I always find the FX series chipsets a little bit hard to guess what you're going to get benchmark-wise. We definitely saw a few surprises today with games running better than we thought and games running a lot worse than we thought. One of the ones that really stood out to me was Overwatch. Now, we've run this on Core 2 Duos and it ran perfectly fine, but on this AMD FX4100, I can't explain it. It just ran trash. Now, it definitely suffered not having 4 solid cores. Now, having these 2 bulldozer cores with shared resources definitely gave us inconsistencies in frame rates in some games. Now, the Intel i3, it's also a dual-core 4-threaded machine, and it suffers from the same inconsistencies as well. That's comparing to the early i3 series. Now, having those 2 extra threads is good, but it's not as good as having proper 2 more cores. Now, secretly, I do like the AMD FX4100. It does have its strengths, but on the other side, it does have some major weaknesses. Look, I would probably recommend, if you're going down the AMD FX route, to buy something with more cores. Something like the 6000 or the 8000 series or even the 9000. Now, in regards to the HD7770, now, we definitely feel that the HD7770 was getting held back by the AMD FX4100, but it varied from title to title. Now, the HD7770 is still quite a capable card, but for most games, you really need to turn it back, especially newer titles. Now, could I recommend this card? It's hard to say at the moment. I think we need to do a little bit more investigations with different CPUs, since the AMD FX4100 was holding us back in games. Anyway, that's all we got today for you guys at the OFFbit. Now, if you liked today's video, please hit that like button. Also, if you have some other video suggestions that you have or some games that you'd like us to benchmark here at the OFFbit, please leave a comment. We do read them. We do respond to them. And lastly, if you really do enjoy our videos, please support us if you haven't already subscribed by hitting that subscribe button. All right, thanks for watching. We'll catch all you guys next time on the OFFbit.